National Democratic Front of the Philippines Peace Panel. He's also the Executive Director of the Philippine Peace Center. Good morning, sir, and thank you for joining us again.
Thank you for inviting me again.
Okay. Just for disclosure, don't have to talk about the details that were discussed during the informal talks in Utrecht. You just came from the Netherlands for this informal talks, basically to set the stage for the resumptions. Let's talk about the prospects. How likely would the formal talks actually resume?
Well, taking the cue from Secretary Dureza, he already announced that there have been some agreements, or the two sides have agreed on common drafts. We can talk about that later. And Secretary Dureza said that the two panels are likely to beat the deadline set by President Duterte, which is 2 months.
In 60 days.
For the resumption.
So paliwanag natin, that's how you understand, on the part of the NDFP, that's how you understand the 60 days.
That's how they understand it.
Ano ibig sabihin ng 60 days? To resume formal talks or to actually finish the negotiations?
I think the understanding is to resume. To resume within 2 months or in 2 months. Since we all know that the talks have been in an impasse. It has been stalled since November. And for some time, in fact, the government has even announced a termination. Although the NDF has always kept its doors open for the resumption of the talks. And true enough, the government, I think last February, announced that they were willing to explore again the possibility of resumption.
Now dito po sa informal negotiations sa Utrecht, ano yung priority sa agenda?
Well, picking up from what they had left off last October, November, the questions of resumption would mean maybe an agreement on amnesty, an agreement on release of prisoners, continuation of agreement on the two items, the major items of the agreement on social and economic reforms. And then the unilateral ceasefires.
Unilateral, okay. So let's talk about the complications for the actual resumption first. Now, yung proscription. How important is it for the government to do something about that proscription petition? Because basically, the government wants a lot of members of the CPP-NPA to be declared as terrorists officially.
Well, true, it is one of the hindrances that would have to be dealt with. But it appears that both sides are willing to just set it aside for now until but I suppose it is something that has to be resolved also before resumption.
When you say set aside, hindi mo na pag-usapan?
Dito sa kanilang preparatory talks.
Dito sa informal?
Yes.
Sa back channel basically. Pero what's the preference of the NDFP?
You have to ask them.
From your side as a consultant, what's the ideal thing to do before we resume peace talks when it comes to this proscription petition?
Yung proscription kasi is like a Damocles sword hanging over the NDFP, especially the consultants, especially those who are out on bail and who should be participating. So you would expect that wala pa naman yung proscription even that has to go through a process anyway. But right now, some of them have already warrants of arrest against them. Some have orders for cancellation of bail. So that means the moment they appear or the moment they are seen by the government, then they can be arrested. Now, that will certainly have to be resolved before the talks can even go through the informals.
Before the informal discussions could actually move forward?
Yes, because the informals involve certain preparations which would need the presence of those consultants who were earlier involved in this.
To be specific, yung mag-asawa, yung the Jamson couple basically kasama sa proscription petition. So how do you expect to talk with the other side if a lot of their consultants and leaders are facing this prospect?
Mr. Chamson is part of the ceasefire committee, He is the chair of the Reciprocal Working Group of the NDFP Reciprocal Working Group for Political and Constitutional Reforms,
PCR.
which is also part of the agenda. Wilma Chamson is head of the Reciprocal Working Group of the End of Hostilities and Disposition of Forces, and she now sits because that group is not meeting yet. Wilma Chamson sits with the ceasefire committee, and both of them, Benny Chamson is a member of the panel, of the NDFP panel. Wilma Chamson is also a consultant. So definitely for resumption, you would expect that their presence would be important.
Now let's talk about the complicated issue of ceasefire. How likely will there be an agreement on a ceasefire during this discussion, this informal round, and then a signing of that agreement during the resumption of the formal talks?
Well, even that has to be done step by step. Having a joint or bilateral ceasefire is a very complicated process. You cannot have that. It's almost impossible to have that agreement in 2 months. In fact, yes, we can say it is impossible to get that agreement in 2 months. So the idea last October was first to have a stand down of forces, which is even one step lower than a ceasefire. Have that stand down of forces and then negotiate a coordinated unilateral ceasefire. That was the idea last October.
Clarify lang natin sa viewers kasi this is a very nuanced and complicated discussion.
Yes.
Ang sinasabi niya impossible to achieve in 2 months ay bilateral ceasefire agreement.
Yes.
But you are working on a coordinated unilateral ceasefire.
The two panels are working.
Yes. So let's talk about the details of a coordinated unilateral ceasefire. Binabanggit doon basically, of course you can correct my terminology, pero ito yung binabanggit ng other side. In so many words, basically the NPA will be confining camps at hindi sila pwede lumabas ng mga areas na yon na dala nila yung baril nila. Would that be acceptable?
But Christian, the thing about ceasefires, if you ask any international expert, is that there is no template for any ceasefire at all. Each side will have to define what kind of ceasefire they want and what it means to have that ceasefire. Ano ba yung terms of reference? So, of course, there are general aspects like separation of forces, definition of hostile acts, the
Buffer zones.
monitoring. Yes, buffer zones is part of separation of forces. And then you have the manner of monitoring and verification, which is also very important for a ceasefire.
So what will be the difference this time? If you talk about a coordinated unilateral ceasefire, ano yung additional features niya? Kasi baka inisip na iba, you're just delaying the process. Baka basically ayaw nyo naman talaga ng stand down.
Well, let's clarify that. My reference point is October, November. At that time, the NDF had already agreed on a stand down of forces. Yung gobyerno yung hindi nag-deliver, no? Now, when we are talking about coordinated unilateral ceasefire, again, as we said, bahala sila eh. Right now, inaano pa yan pinag-uusapan pa. Pero maybe you can have a very broad or an easier term of reference for definition of hostile acts kung meron na silang agad na mapag-agrihan. Last October, the proposal was that we can use the comprehensive agreement on respect for human rights and international humanitarian law, which is already a standing agreement. Pwede yun ang reference because Karil defines certain do's and don'ts, especially dun sa part ng international humanitarian law, which defines the conduct of forces during an armed conflict.
Which actually is good.
Yes.
Maganda sundin yung Karil, di ba?
Yes. Kung ako lang tatanungin. Yes.
Pero dito, kasama rin na, sir, yung joint monitoring, basically. Para hindi lang
one of the ideas then was to have the same, kasi meron ng joint monitoring committee yung Karil, so one proposal was to have the same committee as the monitoring for the ceasefire. But well, there are complications there. So hindi pa yan na I don't think it's being pursued.
Sige.
So there might be some other form of monitoring.
Now, let's say there's an agreement on this coordinated unilateral ceasefire. Will this also translate to the reality or possibility of the New People's Army no longer torching vehicles? Diba ito yung common complaint ni President Duterte? Magiging ganun ba yung translation niya? Mahihinto yung mga ganun activities?
Yun yung sinasabing dapat pag-usapan, ano? And then taking off from earlier, the fourth round, where they had an agreement on interim ceasefire. It was stated there kasi baka when you talk about torching, the government at least relates that to the revolutionary tax. No? The question of revolutionary tax has been put off for the on the agreement, no, it has been put off for the negotiation on political and constitutional reforms. Kasi question yun ng governance.
So hindi pa pinag-uusapan to ngayon?
Sa ngayon, yun ang alam ko, na it is not, at least not until the resumption.
Kasi basically, if you listen to President Duterte, it seems that his priorities are very basic and clear. Ceasefire, non-collection of revolutionary tax. Tapos basically, what do you make of this offer by the government basically to discourage the New People's Army from collecting revolutionary tax? Basically, they would pour in money in terms of development to areas where the NPA is present.
Yes, those proposals or ideas are now, we expect them to be on the table. Pag-uusapan yan.
Pero is the NDF open to that? The idea of that, basically non-collection of rev tax, and then bubuhos na ng gobyerno ng...
I cannot speak for the NDF on that point. Kasi even then, no, I can only relate with the NDF panel. Even the NDF panel says that some points have to be referred to their principal, which is the leadership of the NDF, the National Executive Committee.
Pero so far, wala pang clear position yung NDFP panel doon?
None that I know.
Tsaka, let's talk about the details. Kasi the military is saying more than 1 billion pesos is collected in terms of revolutionary tax. And they're just talking of one front. I think they're talking about Caraga. Tama ba yung details na yan?
Hindi ko alam.
Hindi, sa study, siyempre pag pinag-usapan to sa negotiating table, they have to talk about figures. Kasi the government says, di ba si Duterte, bibigyan ko kayo ng pera, pero how much? Because kung ang estimate is 1.4, 1.7 billion,
hindi pa yung pinag-uusapan.
Wala pa.
Hindi pa yung pinag-uusapan sa lamesa. I don't know about if there are other small group talks or what. Pero sa lamesa mismo, as we have said, that's not yet on the agenda.
Pero yung sinasabi nga nila ng base camp, will that be a tenable or realistic proposition? Yung basically, you confine the NPA to specific camps, and then of course the military and the police cannot be precluded from performing their law enforcement task, pero magpapaalam, coordination basically, para yung template sa MILF.
In the previous drafts I saw coming from the NDF, they were talking about safety zones, no? Hindi camp. Kasi merong connotation yung camp na enclosed, confined, yes. Mukhang hindi pwede yun as far as the NDF is concerned. But they're talking about safety zones where they can be limited if you want to define separation of forces or buffer zones. But those safety zones will have to be defined according to iba-iba kasi archipelagic tayo, maraming islands.
Saka guerrillas eh.
Guerrillas, no? The principle of asymmetry works here. Sa regular armies, you can easily talk about confining an army unit to their barracks or to their, whether that's battalion or company or even brigade. Sa guerrilla, walang ganun eh. So you have to talk about a certain area which is defined na hindi pwedeng magkaroon ng hostile actions doon yung either party. No?
Now, of course, we're not talking here of conditions, no? Kasi kanina napag-usapan natin sa ceasefire at revolutionary tax coming from the government. Basically, that's the demand or aspiration, whatever people might want to call it. Pero let's talk about amnesty at saka release of political prisoners. Kasi before, I think the NDFP was very adamant when it comes to the release of more than 400 political prisoners. Ano yung discussions ngayon? Ano yung focus?
Oh, there's the big difference, Christian. Yung isang binabanggit natin kanina, conditions that have to be negotiated. No? Yung amnesty kasi tsaka yung release of political prisoners have been agreed upon much earlier. So it's a matter of implementation. Which explains why the NDF is insistent on it. First of all, because it is already admitted or recognized, acknowledged as a matter of justice. It's not even a matter of something being negotiated.
Hindi
A
siya
matter of
bargaining chip.
justice. Kasi yung political prisoners are prisoners of conscience. And even international law prohibits criminalization or being charged with criminal offenses for something that is political. Lahat yung mga yun kahit basahin mo yung dyaryo, they are suspected NPAs or suspected supporters of the NPA or not even supporter of the NPA. Si Sister Patricia Fox na supposed to be this. She was being charged of joining anti-government rallies. Of course, kasi she's supposed to be alien, no? But where do you draw the line between anti-government and something that humihingi ng hustisya? Yung
Social justice.
Social justice, no? So that has already been settled. That political prisoners, as yung Karim, 1998, andun yun sa agreement na to release all political prisoners.
Let's go, sir, to the issue of the negotiating with President Duterte. And of course, expectations were high, hopes were high at the start of his administration. And to be fair to the President, mabilis siya naging takbo under his administration.
Definitely, yes.
Pero it doesn't mean it's easy to negotiate with the President. But they make up this President's style of negotiating with the rebels. Kasi parang on one hand, he can be very, very open. On the other hand, sometimes he can just terminate the discussions just like that.
Well, it can be both very challenging and exciting. Kasi it's, full of surprises, good and bad. No? Parang roller coaster nga yung description ng iba. And to tell you the truth, on one hand, you have this unprecedented pace, advances. And on the other hand, you also have these unprecedented moves. Unprecedented hindrances also. Yung proscription.
Sabay din, no?
Yeah. So it works both ways, and we just have to deal with it, no? And we just have to try to deal with it with an open mind and a clear mind. Yung wag masyadong mag-react, no? And try to make the most out of everything.
Pero the idea that the President himself, despite all that has been said and done coming from the President regarding the peace negotiations, some people are thinking, parang baka in the end, he really wants this to be part of his legacy. Kasi ngayon, di ba, he's being attacked when it comes to illegal drugs, human rights violations. But if you're the President, why would you want to be remembered to have done these things instead of focusing on, for example, pag naisara mo yung peace negotiations with the rebels, communist rebels, you implemented the peace agreements with the MILF and MNLF, that would be a very strong legacy for you.
Well, certainly that's one possibility that we should not set aside. No? It can be useful, but at the same time, we have to be guarded. No? It makes us more optimistic, but we have to have some guarded optimism.
Finally pala, before I let you go, the President says he would want Joe Masison to return during the actual negotiations and to have the negotiations here.
Yes.
That is a logical proposition?
Well, certainly. I just read this morning Professor Sison's reply to that. And he said it's a very welcome proposal. He appreciates it very much. He looks forward to closely cooperating with the President on these important issues. but he also describes what are the necessary steps that have to be taken in order to fulfill that that meeting. And part of that, or the first thing, would be to go through with these exploratory informal talks, preparing for the resumption, and then sa resumption to fast track the agreements on the substantive agenda, kasi agreement on social and economic reforms, and after that the agreement on political and constitutional reforms. Of course, this also means implementing the agreements that have already been made, especially CARIN, no? The Agreement on Human Rights and International Humanitarian Law.
But
So it's a very welcome prospect, but as we have already said, it's something that has to be worked out.
Pero coming from a consultant like you, you've been into this for so long. Basically,
25 years.
oh, yung dangers, because sometimes the president can change his mind and basically order the arrest of people.
Yes,
Kasi-
that includes me because I'm on that prescription list.
Yun nga eh. Basically, di ba? So let's say
Yes.
umuwi yung founding chairman ng CPP sa Pilipinas, eh baka magbago ihip ng hangin padampot.
Oo nga. But you know, it shows you how open-minded Professor Sison is, no? He could easily say, no, I don't want because I'm in danger. But he says, no, let's look at that. But there has to be some, what he calls assurances from his lawyers, from the panels, certain things that have to be ascertained first, so that we make sure that no untoward incident would happen. Not so much for the safety of the Professor Sison, but for the safety of the entire peace process. Kasi pag may nangyari, abay, lalo na kay Professor Sison, that's certainly going to terminate fatally the peace process.
Ito very, very briefly. Do you think as a sign of goodwill on the part of the government, withdraw the prescription petition just to show that you are sincere in inviting Sison to return to the Philippines?
That would be a very positive step, but it is something that the NDF is very patient with. Alam din nila na certain legal processes have to be
Okay.
observed, so we can see if that can be worked out.
Okay. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us again this morning. Thank you, po.
Thank you, then, Christian.
Thank you. Up next, netizens call for mental health awareness and gun control after the shooting in Tennessee.